Do you want your slides?
Yes, I'm aiming to stick to 20 minutes. I hope so. I may rush through some of it. But I think at the end of it, uh, it was a trip down memory lane for me. And I don't know why I didn't realize this when I was younger, that we are right and they are wrong. And I will paint a picture of an industry and a government policy which is totally crazy. So thank you, Sally. That's the intro slide, and you made up a very nice promo digital postcard, including an image from a postcard that we produced with 10 things that are utterly bonkers about Hinkley Point C, which is what we're concerned about down in the southwest, but it would apply to any of the nuclear power stations. And we'll be revisiting some of that later on. Okay, next slide. So a quick story of my life, if you could bear it. I was a nerdy youngster and I was rather entranced by all that science stuff. And I think my physics master at school kind of pushed me into it. So I went to university, did physics, and then stayed on and did an MSc and then a PhD in nuclear type stuff. And they teach you all this stuff about how atom bombs kill people, and they kill them in various ways, and it's all very scientifically interesting. But I was a dumb kid, but nobody else was that much brighter either. Nobody put their hand up and said, that's really awful, isn't it? So I drifted through life. I stayed away from weapons and power, but the right hand on the picture on the right hand side of my screen, the person in the white coat in a medical environment, that's nuclear medicine, which I would still defend as actually being a very useful diagnostic imaging system and could be done without the nuclear power program. But I was very much a cog in the machine, brainwashed, I suppose. And middle left, the slide with the red edging around it, was one day I came home from work, switched on the television news, because that's where we got it all from in those days. And those pesky Greenpeace protesters were getting in the way of ships going about their business, dropping barrels of radioactive waste over the side. And the news item informed me that waste was coming from hospital departments like mine. And I knew that was a total lie. And I think that was the turning point in my life when the scales began to fall from my eyes. I was working in the Midlands. Many parts of the country got involved with the miners' strike in the early 1980s. And we're still seeing the tail, the result of neoliberalism, which was the turning point then, the defeat of the miners. I left hospital physics and retrained as a design technology teacher because I liked making things, and carried on until I'm now retired. Further politicization came with the poll tax campaign, and then you can see some people dangling from trees, and in the middle, that was the Newbury bypass protest. But certainly I was drawn to the direct action movement because of people's commitment. Ordinary people become doing extraordinary things, and they seemed to be really sure that and passionate about what they were doing, and I was drawn to that passion. And it's not often a speaker shows a picture of themselves nearly nude, but there we are, things you have to do to attract media attention outside Burfield Nuclear Bomb Factory, the nearly nude naughty nuke protesters outside the bomb factory at noon. You're getting the picture. It actually got a totally disproportionate amount of media attention, and it was a nice sunny day. Thank you. Next slide. This is what I'm doing at the moment. Top left, Extinction Rebellion, and I helped get the ball rolling to form XR Peace as well, which joins up all the important strands around the whole issue of a world that's committed to peace and not war. Down the bottom, you can see people in fancy dress to do with opposing nuclear power. And I've learned a lot from colleagues who are a lot more savvy than I am about opposing nuclear power, because we have had a 10-year campaign against Hinkley Point C, a bit dormant at the moment because, of course, they're busy pouring the concrete and building the thing. Top right, I also become involved in the Palestine campaign, and interestingly, that opened my eyes to British colonial history, the scramble to get the Middle East after the First World War because of the oil resources there. So from coal to oil and now into energy and nuclear power, there is a connection, and the brutal colonial process involved there. The bottom right-hand side of the slide, I now organize a 4-day peace gathering. We squat a park basically in the middle of Bristol, and remembrance for Hiroshima and Nagasaki. So those 4 days, some people around the world will fast for those 4 days. I organize a little mini conference or festival really in the park with a full program of speakers, talks about everything from nuclear power, nuclear weapons, what's wrong, through to migration, environmental issues, social justice, the arms industry, which is big in Bristol, unfortunately. So we try to cover it all. We're very awareness raising. Thank you. Next slide. My anti-colonial analysis. I'd started producing a little zine, a little mini magazine. It didn't get finished, but here is some of the work I did. Suppose you heard there was a gang that had taken over and controlled a country, which is called Britain. And at one time, they'd even stolen a quarter of the entire planet. In fact, there was almost no country they hadn't attacked in some time. And that's a very, very thought-provoking map there that I came across by accident. They did that by military superiority and brutal wars. A turning point in the conquest of Africa was a major battle that took place in Sudan. The thousands of Sudanese warriors fought very bravely with their spears and wooden shields. And the British troops fought very bravely with their field guns, their machine guns, and their rapid-firing rifles. And by lunchtime, they'd slaughtered thousands and thousands of Sudanese warriors. And that's the turning point in the conquest of Africa. Pretty brutal. And of course, that's what carries on to this day. Below is a picture of the Amritsar massacre that shows you what happens if you speak out of a turn. I'm not being anti-British or beating ourselves up, but those in charge have got a lot to answer for. Britain invented the concentration camps during the Boer War and starved tens of thousands of people to death to crush a guerrilla war. We were still brutalizing people in Kenya up to the 1950s and 60s. And the only reason we know about that brutality is they forgot to destroy the records. And you can add to that that Britain invented enhanced interrogation techniques in Northern Ireland. And the Americans said, oh, thank you very much. That will come in useful. This is jumping around a little bit. Once we had nuclear weapons, they're not defense. You can use them to threaten other people. So there was a plan in the 1950s that should the Russians have invaded, America and Britain wanted to protect or deny to the Soviets their oil resources in the Middle East. It was quite an advanced plan. So they imported concrete for capping the wells, explosives to blow things up. Iran, where Britain had major oil reserves, that's where BP comes from, weren't very keen on having their oil refineries blown up. So we had to fall back on a plan, which was to carpet bomb the oil fields with nuclear weapons. Pretty brutal. There was a scrap with China over Hong Kong in 1961, where they were, fiddling with the red button. Indonesia in the early 1960s, the fact we had nuclear bombs stationed in Singapore was a signal to the Indonesians to not do anything that we didn't approve of. I'm not quite sure what Iraq in 1960 was. I've got to look that up a bit more. The Argentine War, yep, we pointed our weapons at their military establishments. And then several times in the various wars on Iraq, basically America has said, if you use chemical weapons, we will nuke you. So nuclear weapons are brandished around fairly routinely. At the bottom, on the left, you've got the champagne glass-shaped curve of global inequality, which I think is absolutely bang out of order. If anybody getting a little bit uncomfortable, like, oh, we've got a bit of a wild one here, but don't we need these things for our defense? Ministry of Defense. That's the most powerful weapon in their propaganda armory. Scientists for Global Responsibility have done a quick survey, and that's that pie chart you see there. 3/4 of British military spending is offense, not defense. So that blows that propaganda trick card straight away. The arms industry I've mentioned, and XRP, of course, is concerned with the military carbon footprint of the military. Next slide. I see time is going on, so I'm going to try and hurtle through this. I was born in 1952. The Queen came to the throne. Britain exploded its first nuclear bomb. There it is. Does anybody know who that slightly worried-looking chap is there? We might need to switch back to the view that shows all the participants. Who's that worried-looking chap there? Anybody like to put their hand up and have a go? Okay, he was the Prime Minister of the democratically elected government of Iran, and Britain was plotting a coup to overthrow them because they wanted, we weren't paying them much for the oil that we were getting out of the ground there, and they were getting pretty fed up with it. Well, plus the fact we were going to blow them up if the Russians came nearby. They were fed up with being treated like colonial pawns, and decided to nationalize the oil industry, which meant they would have got the profits and we didn't. And that was pretty unpopular in this to the government of this country, and we were organizing a coup. We didn't pull it off, so we went to the Americans cap in hand. They did it the following year. They had never done a coup before, and they went, oh, that was quite easy, and then went on to do an awful lot else. And there you have world history. Right, back to the slides. Me and Sally were talking before the show, and I confessed I didn't know what the early British nuclear bombs were called, the Blue Danube, then followed by the Red Beards. I don't know who dreams this stuff up. They weren't exactly to defend this country, because they were stored in the British military bases in Cyprus and Singapore. It was all about defending the empire and fighting other people. In the 1960s through to the 90s, our nuclear weapons were based on board submarines because they can hide under the ocean, they're less detectable. That was the Polaris system, which will be a name familiar to many people here, based at Holy Loch. And I've always I'm nodding to our Scottish friends here, always been curious to go round Loch Long and visit Holy Loch to see what the remnants of that base are. Next slide.
Uh-oh.
Oh.
Sorry, it stopped doing it.
Oh.
I think because I popped in and out from it. Might have to go back there. And then you can tell me which one you had got to.
Go down one, two, three, four. Fifth slide. Next one.
Next one down.
The next one again. Okay, so that's the Trident system, which we all paid for back in the mid-90s, and will last through to just beyond the end of this decade, with a range of about 5,000 or 6,000 miles. 4 submarines, 1 on patrol at any one time, 1 is for repair, so on and so forth. Next slide, please.
Oh.
After when I got involved with the peace movement again, with Trident Ploughshares and with my local CND group, I realized the difficulty of trying to talk to people in the street about, there's a lot of numbers and things, aren't there? So I produced this postcard, and by the way, to all other campaigners, I do recommend postcards as a very handy information source. They're quite cheap to be printed. They might end up on people's fridges, they might get passed around. So I was trying to explain how many people one Trident submarine can kill. And if you do the sums, it's a very frightening number. Probably over 45 million people would be killed by one submarine. That's the total killing power. interesting thing is I'd never seen that ever published by the government because it's pretty truly shocking. That's obscene, that's genocide. And we're paying for it. So the cost of the new Trident replacement system will be well over £200 billion. And the warheads are manufactured at Aldermaston and put together at Burfield, just down the road from you folks, and then transported on armed military convoys on public roads right up to Scotland every month or every 6 weeks, which is quite regular. And there's a wonderful group called Nuke Watch that tracks them. Citizens go out onto bridges and by the sides of roads and photographs them as they go past and gather a lot of information. This would be totally invisible to the public otherwise. Next slide. So these are the sort of little problems that they have with the submarines. And this list is actually off Wikipedia, and it's a mixture of the nuclear armed submarines and also the hunter killer nuclear powered but conventionally armed submarines, which sometimes will be protecting them. So you can see they have a little dodgy record of running aground and causing millions of pounds worth of damage and injuring sailors. British Trident submarine collided with a French one out in the Atlantic because they have got such good invisibility system, they can't see each other. They thought the damage was going to be a mere £50 million, but it got a little bit more expensive than that. HMS Astute ran aground onto a sandbank. I mean, they don't have radar blackout systems for a sandbank, so that's pretty negligent. And one that had its periscope up near Gibraltar collided with a merchant ship. I mean, this is pretty bad driving, isn't it, considering these are nuclear armed submarines. The Vanguard had further problems. The radioactivity in the reactor was beginning to leak and it had to go in for servicing. And it's only taken 7 years and a cool £500 million of our money. I mean, that's more than the servicing on my red van, I'll point out. And there was a test firing back in 2017. And you can see from the picture, it didn't actually go properly. And I think Theresa May's government at the time actually withheld that from Parliament because it might have upset the debate when they were deciding to spend all the money on the Trident replacement. And if they'd seen that catastrophe of a missile launch, you know, who knows, they might have disagreed with it. Down the bottom, I'm highlighting able seaman William McNeely, who actually was not a peace campaigner. He was very committed to his job and he was just horrified that it was being done so badly. So he leaked, this was before WikiLeaks, I think, a dossier with 30 pretty shocking things about life on board these nuclear submarines. I don't understand the more techie things, but I can understand when you go to sea for a year under the ocean, an awful lot of loo roll and there wasn't enough storage places to keep them, so they would be piling up in corridors and blocking cooling systems on important electrical devices, and there was a fire. Oh dear. And security, he ran his own living experiment of checking in and out of the fast lane base. So he rode a motorbike, so he'd take his helmet off and they'd be let through, they'd show their pass. Next time comes in, keeps the helmet on, but pulls the visor up. They can look at your face. Off you go, Jimmy. That's fine. Next time, keeps the visor down. Still gets waved in. Well, this was pretty sloppy security. I think his famous soundbite was, it was harder to, there was more security getting into a nightclub in Glasgow than there was getting into the fast lane nuclear submarine base. Right. Quick question at the bottom. How many nuclears? We've had about 20 nuclear powered or nuclear armed, nuclear powered submarines, and they all come to the end of their life. Think of a scrapyard. How many have actually been taken apart and completely dismantled? Quick answer, sorry. It's a right round number. None whatsoever. They're piling up in Rosyth and Plymouth. And quite a lot of them have still got the reactors in and they have to be kept on electrical systems to keep the cooling systems going. If the shilling ran out in the meter, the reactor could well overheat and catch fire. Pretty risky, pretty sloppy, isn't it? That's the picture I'm painting. Next slide. I'm aware of the time, so I'm really going to push on with this. I've covered this really. CND's calculated 200 billion over the lifetime of the thank you, Margaret. I wasn't sure where Rosyth was. I thought it's on the Glasgow side, but you say it's on the Edinburgh side. Thank you. There, 200 billion, that's what the Trident replacement is costing us. And down the bottom, I stumbled across the figure of what it costs to guard all these nuclear facilities. That's another 74 million pounds of our money per year. Keep those pesky peace campaigners out and such like. That's a colossal sum of money. Money seems to be no object when it comes to the military. Next slide.
Yes.
Down in your part of the world, this is south of the M4, so Aldermaston bottom left, and Burfield more in the middle and towards the top. And the yellow line is the M4. I've got to admit it, I'm a bit of a nutter. I can be on the National Express coach going to and from Bristol, and there's, you know, ordinary people around me, and I'm sort of going, oh, that's Britain's nuclear bomb factory over there. And they don't seem to take much notice, because who would believe that you can see Britain's nuclear bomb factory from the motorway? And of course, it's been in special measures for a number of years on safety. I mean, it is a nuclear bomb factory. What could possibly go wrong? I can hear you all falling around with laughter in the background. Next slide. And this is the story of what we did back in 2018. And Sally, that's why we met outside the court. How many people does it take to close down a nuclear bomb factory? Well, not many, actually. 9 people locked on that day to cars and across that big gate, which is where the convoys come out, and closed the base to vehicle traffic for a lot of the day. When it went to court, half of them were on the wrong charge and they walked free. So that was good news. So these places are pretty crazy. Next slide. Just jumping back to Nukewatch. Down the bottom, it's fallen off the bottom of my screen actually, so you may not be able to see it. Marvellous organisation, Nukewatch. Well, they're up in Scotland. That's always an advantage. They produced a report about the civil defence response should anything ever go wrong with that convoy. You know, vehicles do crash on the roads. The worst scenario would be if, say, one of those warhead trucks collided with something like a fuel tanker and there was a bad fire, in which case it would spread several kilograms of plutonium downwind by perhaps quite a long way. Off the bottom of the quote is, it might impair Britain's ability to function as a sovereign state. That's about as bad as you can get. Right, next slide. So they don't care about our safety. When I've been in correspondence with Sally, I've said we've got some resources. I've mentioned the postcard, and this was also a sort of A5 folded flyer, which I tried to summarize the whole of the nuclear program. You know, the uranium comes in and how it's processed, goes to the nuclear power stations, and then the fuel rods, when they come out, they have to be cooled on site, and then they're put on the trains with those funny square white boxes on the back and transported back through the middle, our main railway station, about 4:30 every Wednesday afternoon past the main platform. Don't tell the terrorists, they might do something silly. And again, speaking as a former nuclear scientist, the actual reality of this, I never realized it. Next slide. And that's the inside. And the 10 things that are bonkers about Hinkley Point C. I mean, phenomenal cost. They lie when they say it's low carbon. They're having a decommissioning consultation. It came up on my Facebook feed. They actually called it zero carbon electricity. And I challenged them on this, and they said, oh, we're allowed to say that when it's running. That's a bit like if I drove my car to the top of a hill and then let it coast down, I could say it wasn't using any fuel. It used a lot of fuel to get it to the top of the hill.
Yeah.
And that's what it amounts to. They don't want to talk about, you know, the mining and the refining and or even what to do with the waste afterwards. They certainly don't want to count the carbon footprint of the nuclear disasters, which are off the scale. Spending all this money a lot of money on nuclear power, blocks renewables, which are now getting vastly cheaper. If you want to have the stuff, some material for stand-up comedy sketches, just look up the history of the EPR, the European Pressurized Reactor, on Wikipedia. I mean, the first one they started building in 2006 is yet to work. I'll let that sink in.
2006.
Yeah. We know radiation's bad for us, but it's been very hard to nail, the effects around power stations. But Sellafield, I'll be coming to this next, is unbelievably disastrous. Rising sea levels will overwhelm. Nuclear power stations have to be mostly pretty well on the coast. The French have got a few on rivers, but that's not proving very successful. And we've got one in Wales on the lake, but most of them are by the sea. And rising sea levels, oh dear.
Yeah.
And they're colossally expensive. And we'll be coming back to the bomb links as we get on. Right, next slide. I just want to help you with two bits of ammunition, so to speak, because when we've been doing outreach tours, people come along and talk about, oh, small modular reactors, fusion, thorium, something my mate saw on a video on YouTube. When I was at university, the in thing then was fast breeder reactors. They would breed more fuel than they would use. This was the hope for the future. And there was a prototype at Dounreay in the north of Scotland. Sorry, Scotland. England seems to shove all its dangerous stuff up your way. Fueled with mixed oxide fuel, which of course contains plutonium, and cooled with liquid sodium metal. What could possibly go wrong? It did actually work for quite a few years. The Japanese had one which worked for 1 hour at colossal expense. And now they're trying to take it apart. The official report says much of Dounreay's nuclear waste management was poor. This is a new definition of the word poor. They were bunging stuff down a disused shaft in an ad hoc manner with no reliable record keeping. And once it all exploded because they were mixing chemicals. Oh, and by the way, they flushed hundreds of thousands of fuel rod debris onto the beaches, and they're closed to the public. They're having to invent machines which can crawl around on the seabed and actually find these little bits of debris. I mean, it's absurd. And here is your trump card. When the private companies like EDF pull the last fuel rod out of their reactors and walk away with the profits they've made selling us their highly expensive electricity, guess who pays to decommission the reactors and all the waste that's piling up in a very dangerous state in Sellafield? It's us. It all comes out of the public purse. And the latest article, which came out in The Guardian only a couple of months ago, it's going to cost £260 billion. That's £250 billion of our money, which is even more than we're spending on the power station. So nuclear is totally unaffordable. Right, next slide. The wind scale fire. Maybe we haven't got time to do this interactively. Anybody who does nuclear physics learns about this at university. Both me and my housemate have both learned about it, but I never thought what it was that caught fire. So next slide. What caught fire was a thing called a pile, and you've probably had them near you at Harwell and the other places around there that I'm a bit vague about. So they were the prototypes, and this was the full-scale factory, so to speak. Uranium in graphite pile, air blowing through, keep it cool. And on Wikipedia, down the bottom, it will say this plutonium was intended for weapons purposes. So that's where Britain was getting the plutonium for that explosion that you saw in Australia in 1952. And that was the basic design for nuclear power stations. Next slide. The Magnox generation of nuclear power stations, which ran from the 50s right through to the 70s, were actually optimized for the production of plutonium for the British bomb program.
Yeah.
Full stop. It's on Wikipedia. It's in the public domain, although it was kept a secret at the time. I guess that's also actually breaking the non-proliferation treaty. But when did Britain ever care about international law? So next slide. I'm aware time is going on. So we get to the heart of things. Andy Sterling and Phil Johnson are two wonderful academics down at Sussex University, and CND did a webinar with them in 2017. So this is on the CND website, but I'm going to expand on what their discussion are on the next slide. Very tactfully, so this was after they published this after the government said it was going to have a nuclear renaissance. It was aiming to build 16 gigawatts of new nuclear power stations. So something like Hinkley Point C is 3.2 gigawatts. So I think they're aiming for about 7. And they rather politely point out, this is difficult to justify based on economics alone. I've given you a flavour of the costs. And if you compare Britain with Germany, both advanced industrial capitalist countries, Germany is switching off its nuclear power stations, and Britain is building more of them. And yet we have far more attractive renewable resources. We have a long coastline, a lot of wind, a lot of wave, a lot of tidal. And they point out, and the penny hadn't dropped for me, nuclear-powered submarines are amongst the most complex and demanding artifacts, things that we make. You could compare these in complexity, technical complexity, to the space shuttle. I hadn't seen it like that. And the problem is that in order to keep those submarines going, you imagine a pyramidal system, you need to have a nuclear skilled workforce. Look at me, I've left, I've gone bad. There's always a dropout rate. You need to have an engineering and manufacturing capability to make big metal things. You think there's one massive forge master in Sheffield. It's only one place in the country now that can make really big engineering parts. Remember, Thatcher closed down our manufacturing industry. There isn't a lot left. And then the whole complexity of the logistics and supply chain. If you don't have that, your submarine is not going to sail. And you've seen the problems they're having anyway. And in order to maintain that, well, they could either pay for it direct, but that would be an embarrassingly big price tag for the military, or you can hide it in the civil nuclear power program. And that, Phil and Andy have put their finger on it. That's exactly what the government's doing. Next slide. Though this is their summary, it's a trip down memory lane. In the early 2000s, nuclear energy seemed to fall out of high-level favour in the government. And there's these things called PIUs, which I hadn't heard of, but there were sort of government processes to look at, power production, for example. And in 2002, renewables were already coming over the horizon, and they could see that was the way of the future. And their recommendation that the UK should move towards a decentralized electricity grid based around renewables and energy efficiency. Wow, that's what we still dream of, isn't it? What came next was one of the most abrupt policy turnarounds in UK history. Tony Blair launched another energy review in 2005. But instead of it being a transparent and independent review like the PIU system, it was, and this is a wonderful quote here, isn't it? It was undertaken by a few partially identified individuals. Partially identified, these were shady characters inside the Cabinet Office. According to a nuclear advocate called Simon Taylor, this involved a select group of the most other civil servants in the Cabinet Office who did not know even existed. This is dodgy stuff. This is how the energy policy of our country was redirected in favour of nuclear power. So you can see Greenpeace put up a good fight and went to the High Court. It was declared unlawful and deeply flawed, and Blair pushed ahead anyway. And then that's how we got to the point of the nuclear renaissance, and that's the era that we're living in now. Next slide, nearly at the end. So back in 2017, there were newspaper headlines, electricity consumers to fund nuclear weapons through Hinkley Point C. And that's the era that we're in now. And Sally, you were referring to that CND webinar where we were all together. And Andy and Phil did admit that actually, although there was a brief bit of interest from the media, that then died out, and now they're being ignored. So undoubtedly what they're saying is 100% true, but the whole bandwagon just moves on. So this is the irrationality of the situation that we're in now. Next slide. So just going back to the postcard I referred earlier, this is our one for Hinkley Point C. All the nasty aspects, 10 things that are bonkers about Hinkley. And that's why we put the nuclear bomb down at the end, because if Britain wasn't maintaining its nuclear weapon system, we wouldn't be having nuclear power stations. Renewables are cheaper, lower carbon, they don't leave waste, they're not dangerous when they go wrong, so on and so forth, all these things that we know. Next slide. A quick summary of some possible sources, but I'm not the best of researchers, so there might be others as well. And the last slide. If we want to meet up in person, the giant Peace CND logo will be visiting the Embrace the Base event at Aldermaston over the weekend of the 9th to the 11th of December. And that's on the CND site, and it will also be on the Aldermaston Women's Peace Camp. So be nice to see some of you then. Right, that was more than 20 minutes. I do apologize. I hope it was worth it, but thank you so much.
Thank you.
Good.
Thank you very much, Roland. That was, I don't think anybody's going to mind the little bit of extra time you took. It was all on the ball as far as I'm concerned. And it was a bracing account, and seems to me a completely valid one. It could be that others don't agree, and that they can ask questions if they wish. So I'm sure you'll be happy to take any questions. Anybody want?
Ginny's got a hand up, I think. No? Oh, sorry.
Yes, Philip's got his hand up, is he? Oh, no.
I think just wave if you want to say something.
Tony Godfrey.
I always suffer a bit from information overload, and you've made your points very, very fully and very convincingly, and I'm not going to dispute that. But can you, we're so much in our society sort of crowded down with information these days, the internet, and, well, I don't have to elaborate, but could you say what would you advise as the best way of making people aware or worried about things? Because there's an amazing indifference one senses, and how can you break this down?
Thank you.
Yeah, well,
Tony, that is really the most important question, and that's very thought-provoking. You put your finger on it entirely. I mean, the group I was in, which was called SWAN, Southwest Against Nuclear, has ground to a halt because after 10 years, you know, the small group of activists had burnt themselves out, really. But we'd been doing outreach stalls, like at major festivals like Glastonbury, talking to people till we're tired. And what we're up against is an enormous propaganda industry. So that's why I put in the extra bit about, you know, the small modular reactors, the fusion, the thorium, the gee whiz, it's going to work. My mate saw a diagram on the internet. Well, they can't even get the conventional reactors to work. You know, the EPR is a development of earlier reactors, and when Britain changed over from Magnox to the AGR family of reactors, the advanced gas-cooled reactors, the ones that are just coming to the end of their life now, they took decades to make them work. I live in Bristol, so Bristol's famous for the suspension bridge. You show a gorge to an engineer, they can build a bridge across it, and they seem to last. Power stations are far more complex for reasons I can't explain. But that none of that seems to get in the way of the the propaganda which comes out of the industry. Here in Bristol, they're going to take radioactive waste and turn it into batteries. Batteries are a very tiny electrical output. Oh, it's better than that. They're going to take the radioactive waste and turn it into diamonds. Oh, that's really exciting. So they're safe. Diamonds can't be, rubbed and crushed and leaked. So if you want to keep your pacemaker going for the next 10,000 years, could be very useful to have one of these batteries, but they sell it under the guise of sustainable energy. The propaganda coming out of the industry, and I have to say the green ambassadors who speak in favor of nuclear has an enormous brainwashing effect. I mean, I've got a friend who's passionate about defending the NHS, and every time I see him, he goes, "Oh, I was talking to somebody in the street or in the queue for the doctors or in the clinic or something like that. Said, do you know they're going to privatize the NHS?" And he goes, "And they didn't know." Yeah, they are working on planning the privatizing the NHS, and people don't know. People are so brainwashed by the mainstream media. I'm in Extinction Rebellion. In a way, this is constant concern about how the actions that people do and what slogans they have on their banners and what they do and how it's pitched to the media. And as you know, there's a big debate on Insulate Britain and Just Stop Oil by doing sort of fairly shocking things to try and break through the media holds on people's brains and make them realize that we're all about to die of climate change, which is pretty serious. Yeah, Tony, you've asked the right question, and maybe we all have to go away and think about that because we've got a hard slog ahead of us. The information shared here is absolutely damning for the nuclear industry. It's totally crazy. And yet it continues because it has, national government backing. That's what we're up against. I wish I knew the answer.
Yeah, well, thank you. Thank you.
Thank you.
Can I ask you, you just said about William McNeely, who ran away from the sub because he said it was so dangerous. Any idea what happened to him?
He was sort of quietly shunted off the scene, dishonorably, whatever it's called in the military circles. Yeah,
and was he silenced?
Very quietly. I don't think he was punished. I'm sure it's all in the public domain.
Yeah.
When there's a whistleblower like that, they'll either make an example of them and punish them very, very horribly, or they'll just get rid of them very quietly. And I think that's what happened to him. He went on the run and then he returned and gave himself up.
Yeah.
And then it all went quiet.
They probably paid him not to say any more.
Or threatened him. The military are pretty strict. I've just heard that it might be coming to an end, fingers crossed, but the ghastly deportation flights to Rwanda, that they were going to be handled by the military. So they'd probably go from Bryce Norton or somewhere like that, a military base, and troops would not be allowed to exercise their right of conscience to not participate in that. And I've got a friend who works in that sort of area. This sounds like the thin end of the wedge of trying to remove the right of conscience of troops to disobey. Joe Glenton and such like, who went to Afghanistan. This is horrible. This is terrible what's happening. We shouldn't be doing it. Refused to go. I'll look it up. That will be interesting. Perhaps we can all look up what happened to that young lad. He was only 25. But as I say, I think he did it because he actually believed in the system. He was shocked that it was a bit of a shambles rather than the other way around. Thanks.
Linda.
Hello from Appalachia. And thank you, Roland, for a terrific presentation. A lot of what you said rang true to us here in the States. Philip is joining us too from APEC, especially about that those secret meetings with respect to the nuclear, I mean, generally speaking, the energy policy of your country. The same thing happened to ours during the Bush administration, when secret meetings became known to be happening, and very little became revealed in terms of who attended. And I think that it was a gem of information regarding nuclear submarines being so complex. You know, we don't, activists like me, don't know all of the technical details of what these devices, including nuclear weapons, you know, or how they're really fabricated. So, so to compare it to the space shuttle is helpful. It's helpful for public education, you know, that kind of thing that we all need to constantly work on. And I have a question, and this is technical question regarding the Trident missiles there in the UK. Your graphic said that it was that each Trident missile had 8 or the submarine. Well, I might have gotten this wrong. Each submarine had 8 US Trident missiles. Is that right?
Yes.
And
Yeah.
each missile has 5 British warheads.
Yeah. On little
So how
individually steerable rockets. Actually, the submarine has got 16 firing tubes, but Britain said it would only load 8 of them. But the total capacity is 16. And who knows what they're getting up to, and probably they're ramping it up now. I mean, Boris Johnson just spent a mint of our money fattening up the military, a 10% rise over 5 years, and some of that money straight away went on upping the number of nuclear warheads by 40%, which is a colossal rise. So they might be, goodness knows, but yeah, Coalport is going to get even bigger. Ginny, you're going to have to be out in your canoe again to do a landing.
Wow.
But generally speaking, it's shocking what
And,
governments are doing in our name, or rather behind our backs.
Right.
Linda, it's nice to hear your
Yes,
accent.
and
I was very impressed with one of your writers called Eric Schlosser. He gave a talk in my town, and I could listen to his accent all evening. It was beautiful. But he's an investigative journalist, writer, done a number of things, and he's published a book called Command and Control about the nuclear near misses. That is such a read. That was jaw-dropping. I mean, particularly in the early stage of the Cold War, nuclear bombs were falling out of the sky all the time. A number of times that, and because this was American information, he said, at least we can get the information in America. So it's pretty quiet on the British side. A number of times that America nearly nuked itself is just jaw-dropping. And these things are inherently incredibly dangerous, and complex systems will fail in unpredictably complex ways. I recommend that book. I got my local library to buy it in, and I hope people are still reading it now. Eric Schlosser, Command and Control. It's a very good history of nuclear weapons as well, by the way. And he's a very good speaker.
Well, I wanted also to congratulate the Peace Camp for 40 years, and I want to say that APEC also just celebrated its 40th birthday this past October. We had a celebration, and but we don't do courageous actions like you guys. I mean, really, kudos to your for your steadfastness and your courage. I mean, really, it's very, very, very impressive. And I thank you for it. Thank you for it.
Well,
And
I'll say it's
congratulate you.
brave people like Ginny and Margaret who are doing the actions. I'm just the techie in the background, you know, bringing the canoes or lock-on tubes or whatever, all the equipment.
It's
Well,
teamwork, Roland. It's always
I
teamwork.
mean, really.
Can I tell you just very, very quickly about a thing that it happened January 2020, but it just came to court a few weeks ago, and I went along to support the two people who'd did the action and were brought, and they broke into Coolport. Now that's where the nuclear weapons are loaded onto the submarines, and from there they are then armed to go and threaten everyone around the world. But they walked for 2 hours over rough ground, hilly ground, to get to the far side of Coolport, and they broke in, they cut the fence, and they got in to the loading dock, and one person stayed outside sitting on the rectangle of wire with the bolt cutters. They first of all put up banners on the outside of the fence and then thought, oh, go inside. So the other person went inside, rehung the banners inside, and went for a wander. And then she was spotted, and they were both women, spotted, and the alarm was raised, but the two MOD people who were going to attend to it were told to go and they were normally had weapons, they were told to go and put them in the box, lock them up and go in. This is without knowing who had broken in. I mean, they obviously saw the person, but they didn't know if they were being coerced into doing anything. So they but it took them 50 minutes after the alarm had been raised to get to the person who'd gone in.
Amazing.
And the reason it had done that, there was a fence and a gate into that area, although they were still within the outside fence of the fence of the base, and they couldn't find the key to get through the gate. So it took them 50 minutes and another 50 minutes because they hadn't noticed the other person sitting just at the hole. But this is how serious that was. And the MOD underplayed it so much. It didn't go to a high court, it didn't go to a sheriff court. It went to a justice of the peace court in local Dumbarton, a small town, and they ended up, the person who was sitting outside got admonished, which meant they just got, oh, you were very naughty. And as soon as they left the court, there was no record of it. And the other person got fined £210. And the person who'd been in the Justice of the Peace Court just before that, it was a local neighbours dispute. And this woman had been sitting upstairs in her flat and had been sitting on her settee, hammering the floor to her downstairs neighbours with the handle of a broom. And that woman had got fined £230, more than the other person who had been guilty of breaking into the UK's nuclear establishment, where the weapons that come up from Burfield are loaded onto the UK's nuclear submarines. They had completely underplayed it, and it wasn't in the mainstream.
Yeah.
I sat and listened to all of that. Quite incredible.
Quite incredible.
They hid that. So there you are.
Mm.
Very not good.
Crazy. Mm.
Are there any more contributions people would like to make? You've had an excellent, sorry, go ahead.
Hi.
Go ahead.
Sorry, I've had my hand up for quite a long time.
I'm
yes,
sorry.
It's all right. Yes, I just want to make a quick comment on that last point. That is, it's all about making sure these things don't get into the media, don't get any publicity, and they literally just drop to keep it all
Yeah.
very quiet. And other people who do civil disobedience find exactly the same thing.
Mm.
I wanted to just get back onto the fact that we've increased our nuclear weapons by 40%. I believe it's because they didn't actually get round to dismantling the ones, about 240 I think we've got, and we were supposed to drop back to 180. They haven't dismantled them, so they've simply said, oh well, we're going to have 240 instead of 180, and broken the terms of our signing of the non-proliferation treaty, because I think that was actually something we signed up to do. So Boris Johnson has just basically broken the treaty by doing that. The other thing I just wanted to ask Roland, which I'd love these postcards, Ro, that you've got with the drawings on them. So could you send me something? Yes, yeah. Could you send me something by email? Something we can have them printed, because I do think they're so beautifully synced. You know, they put the whole thing in a really very understandable form. You know, people
Well,
do
thank
like
you. You
cartoons.
put your
don't
finger
they?
on it, because
Yeah.
this was the challenge, to have 10 things in almost like one sentence, one-liners, really,
Yeah.
to condense it all down. And you can see from my 20-minute talk, which was more like 40 minutes, it is very hard to condense down a big story into a few soundbites.
It is indeed, yes.
So I have sent these to Sally.
Mhm.
There's the postcards, and then there's, I've lost it.
Yeah.
Yeah, here we go.
So Caroline, if you emailed us at abingdonpeace@gmail.com,
Mm.
or are you a peace group member? I can't,
It's Salisbury CND.
but not in Abingdon,
No, we're Salisbury CND.
right? Oh, you're Salisbury. Okay.
Yes.
So I could if I send them to Peter, I've got Peter's
Yeah,
email address.
yeah, that would be great if you would. Because
Yeah.
I think we should get some of these printed up, and they'd be very useful, because in Salisbury we're hoping to start a sort of a kind of an eco hub thing, which means that we're going to have lots of groups all under one roof or under one umbrella, which means that we can give these out to people on market stall or from a premises or whatever,
Yeah.
and start the conversation, because it's really important. We've got to connect it with climate change, of course, and that's really where it's at. It's great. I love them. I think they're brilliant.
Right. So I think Sally has got the set, or contact me direct. And there's an online printing firm called Solo Press. So these are about £30 1,000 delivered to your door within 24 hours.
My gosh, that's good.
Because they have machines that are geared up to produce. These are flyers for gigs and such like. Very popular size. And if you're trying to interact with the public, you can't tell them the long story. You've got to try and give them a short story.
Yeah.
It's on a postcard.
Very good. Could you send us the link to Solar Press as well, Roland?
Just Google Solar
Just
Press.
Solar Press.
It
Okay.
comes up on Google. Fine.
By the way, I wanted to say congratulations to Salisbury on having got your mayor to sign up to be a mayor for peace.
Wow.
That's fantastic.
Yes.
Yeah.
If you hadn't said that, I would have. Well done. Peter's signed in, but he's on mute.
Yeah.
But Caroline is speaking.
We were both there, plus a few others, and it was very, very close. There were 8 votes, both for and against, and 3 abstentions, which rather kind of upset the mayor, because he thought that the 3 abstentions would be voting in favour. Lib Dems, who sat on the fence, I'm afraid, and he luckily had the casting vote, so it was carried, much to the annoyance of some of the rather more vociferous Tory councillors. And we are now officially part of Salisbury has joined Mayors for Peace.
What we have not twigged, because I looked on the Mayors for Peace website, is that Abingdon is part of Mayors for Peace.
Yeah.
And we haven't done enough with that. We need to talk about that. See if we can actually use that to, deliver it.
Yes, yes,
Yeah.
yes.
Would it now be appropriate to sort of slowly close down the meeting?
I think so.
So I'd obviously very much like to thank Roland for talking tonight. He's kind of expressed a counterculture of which we all surely subscribe to in one way or another. And it's important that this culture continues. I mean, you know, the C&D movement has ebbed and flowed in big ways over the last 40, 50 years. And suddenly you can find that you've got a mass movement saying the things that we've been saying and hearing tonight. Quite apart from that, which is, I would like to thank Row 4, he's also given us so much vital information, and in a way that's really, you can get a grasp on. I think I will need to see the recording to get the full benefit again and again, to get the full benefit of what we heard tonight. But there's so much massive information, valuable information there. You know, I wouldn't begin to be able to say what he's left out that he shouldn't have left out. I'm sure he could. But so thank you very much, Ro, for giving us your time and being so almost light-hearted about it. Not really. So I'll applaud before I say any more stupid things.
Well, can I say thank you to all of you as well, and a wonderful audience from all around the world, and also so delighted to have Ginny and Margaret joining in as well to you know, talk about our experiences in Scotland, and perhaps in a way between us, talking about the successes of the Mayors for Peace and rebuilding the peace movement. Perhaps that's the answer to that tough question, which is like, what are we going to do about it? So we'll all go away from this meeting and you know, start coming up with new ideas or redoubling our efforts we know we're armed with the truth. We just have to get it out there. No, thank you all very much.
Or people can challenge it. Yeah.
Thank you.
Bye.
Thank you. Bye-bye, everybody.
Bye.
Bye,
Thank you.
everyone.
Bye.
Thank you, Mike, for making it possible.
Thank you.
Thank you, Sally.
Where are you?
I'll pull the plug, shall I?
Yeah.